Hello again, and welcome to episode 9, the penultimate episode of Persians, the podcast. The ghost of King Darius does not make an especially dramatic departure. His final lines of advice to his people remind me of one of my favourite sonnets. He tells them to love that well which they must leave ere long. It is what happens during Darius's appearance, this segment of the play that came entirely from Aeschylus's imagination, that makes this play particularly relevant today. As well as the intercultural politics between Greece and Persia, West and East, that we've discussed at length, we have here an even more urgent warning. Here it is described by Lydia Koniordou.
Something which is very contemporary, which is the connection with the climate catastrophe, the attempt to control nature, to create profit from it, which Xerxes does. He goes against the current of Bosporus, and he hits Bosporus, and he goes beyond a certain limit of respect to the natural world. And that's another hubris, and that there is a big part in Darius that he speaks about it. Of course, in a parabole, that is, he says that he thought he could win Poseidon, meaning the sea, of course, not the god. And of course, what is killing us today is that those who die don't really need wealth anymore. That's what Darius ends with. There's little, they can profit very little, and not at all from wealth, the dead.
As the smoke clears, or the ghost vanishes, yet again we see the chorus and the queen having to steel themselves and move on. To me, it's quite a significant impulse running through the play, particularly for Queen Atossa. She has to assimilate this information given to her, and she must decide how to continue. The chorus speaks first.
Bhí sé peanmhar orm triblóidín na marbarach a chlos an ish agus an amatá roin.
It is painful, they say, hearing about the suffering of their people, both now and in the future. Darius didn't discuss Salamis alone, but gave that grisly prediction of the bloody fate that awaits the Persians who stayed in Greece. The queen has her own reaction. She laments the fact that her son is in this state, that his awful sufferings have left him quite literally in rags. We could be tempted to think that this is a vain woman who's concerned only with appearance, but bear in mind, Aeschylus has equated her with Persia. If she is Persia, then her son is the future of Persia. We've heard references to his clothing throughout the play, in Atossa's dream, in the messenger's description, from Darius, and now yet again from the queen. We know that the chorus's costumes, and Atossa's golden chariot, and even Darius's yellow slippers, will have all helped to construct this image of opulent Persian extravagance. So Xerxes' clothes represent the pride and the wealth of his country. And in the aftermath, that pride and that wealth have taken a severe battering, and so his clothes are likewise reduced to rags. No wonder then that his mother laments this. It's far, far bigger than any concern about how he looks in public. And she has a plan. She will go back to the palace and prepare fresh clothes for him, because they must endure. They must carry on.
Aye, tá mór an pianta ag gail scealadam, agus an mí ortún is módóibh ile go léir, ná go bhfuil mo wach náirithe ag na giobal atá a chorp. I mói mé láireach ban agus jói mé róbi balastó, agus rahi mé fuinien. Mar ní hepi mé artho siúd is ansalom in am na tréalach.
Atossa has been our mirror through the play. She represents Asia, and it is to her that we must look to see how the empire will react. She's had consistent bad news throughout, with the promise of worse to come, as Lydia explains.
And of course, she goes to the gods and blah, blah, blah. And then she goes to her husband, calls her husband for help. And then he leaves not even help, but even worse, that all this will get worse. It hasn't ended. There's more coming. So they leave them in a worse situation than before. It's another stroke, another blow with Darius. And then she ends up and says, I'll bring my son new clothes. I will not abandon him. And then she goes. She disappears.
The queen now exits because Aeschylus doesn't need her anymore. This is not the kind of play that will have a recognition scene where the hero comes home and his mother will greet him. Far from it. Atossa exits because we don't really need to see any kind of transfer of authority. Once Xerxes comes back, he is the most powerful person in Persia, and so Aeschylus does not need for us to see the queen anymore. It's unsentimental, but dramatically effective, particularly in a theatre that has only 2 actors. According to Aristotle, it was Aeschylus who introduced a second actor in tragedy and reduced the importance of the chorus in favour of dialogue. Professor Oliver Taplin doesn't quite agree, as he explains.
This is something on which I've got an unorthodox view. I don't think tragedy ever had only one actor.
Okay.
I think it had 2 actors from the start, and I think when these things are changed, they're not changed by an individual playwright. The old later antiquarian writers loved to attribute inventions to people, and this is already there in Aristotle's Poetics. He said Aeschylus changed the number of actors from 1 to 2, and Sophocles changed it from 2 to 3. I think tragedy had 2 actors right from the start. But it is a play with only 2 actors, that's right. The first place we've got with 3 actors is the Oresteia, which is 14 years later.
At this moment in the play, the 2 actors exit in quick succession. Darius goes back to the undiscovered country, and Atossa departs again for the palace. The chorus hasn't been alone on stage for a few hundred lines of poetry, and now they perform another Stasimon. In this one, they reminisce about how great Darius was and the successes of Persia during his reign. There's a nostalgia to this, a longing for a past and for a home that no longer exist. The chorus sings of how well managed their cities were when Darius ruled, how their military campaigns were successful, how their laws were effective and governed their lives, and how their men came home from battle to their families, uninjured and unharmed.
O Popoi, Cadé go mór is go sunna a bhí an ord sívalta seo gwine, nuair a réalaí an seanraí Darius a bhí omláin an hain, gan díomháil, gan chalúnt chuma na néithe.
Mar dúis chruthí mar sin féin go glórfar, ar 80 míle. Agus an son bhí chóras dlíogain choláidir le túr, ar rialaigh gach éalród. Tháinig ar gcuid fear a bhaile sláán chuna dailigh, gan créachtaí, gan díomháil.
The chorus now moves into another list, in which they catalogue a variety of the cities and states and islands that were under Darius' control. He ruled over so many cities without ever having to cross the Halys, the red river that divided Lydia from Persia. He controlled the cities well beyond the rivers and the lakes, all the way as far as Thrace and the Black Sea, and the Hellespont.
Céfed caithir a ghabh sé gan fiú áha an Halys asnú, gan fiú a hinteán hain a ágant, na cáracha a chalóacha hartfa bá cóngarach Straiman, na dúnfort sa tráis.
Agus na carracha feistethe ag fallí a dalamh tírim leas mut an loch, do lachadar leis mar rí. Iad site go chuimhreach á leathan heile, agus cuanta cúnga an prapontis, agus béal na mara duibhe.
The Hellespont was the site of Xerxes' greatest hubris, so naturally the little mention keeps him in our minds. Contrasting him with his father, the chorus continues the list of Darius' conquests, but their nostalgia for them would have resonated rather differently for the first audience of the play. By the time Aeschylus wrote The Persians, Athens had taken back control of many of these places, so there's a doubly political vibration in hearing these names. Ironically, the Persians list them as they remember their beloved king, but the Athenians in the audience would have enjoyed the list because they knew that the Persians didn't control them at all anymore. As he did with Darius and Plataea, Aeschylus is playing with information, manipulating what is in the past and what is, for the chorus at least, still in the future.
Agus na Ealaíon suite ag an bhuir an gcósta hall den lehanis, a líon cóngaracht an tír seo, chuma Lesbos agus Samos, a chohíonn Ológa, Chios agus Paros, Naxos, Mykonos agus Andros, an córsa cóngaracht der Tenos.
Agus do réalaigh sé na Ealaíon suite ag an bhuir fan na cóstaí, Lemnos agus Icaria, Rhodos agus Cnidos agus Cartacha na Cipide, Paphos, Soloi agus Salamis, gur bí a bmháthair stáit údar an olagóin faoi láthir.
This catalogue lists some of the most famous islands in the Mediterranean, a must-see list for any island-hopping trip. The chorus at once reminds Athens of what she has regained in new or restored alliances, and of some of the sites that the Persian survivors must have passed on their way home. The last place on the list is Cyprus, the farthest kingdom from Athens and the closest to Persia. Aeschylus lists 3 of its most famous cities, Paphos, Soloi, and finally, Salamis. The city shares its name with the island of Ajax, and again we are returned to the site of the Persians' defeat. This double-edged geography might seem like just a list to us now, but it would have been very pleasing to a Greek audience. And even while this Persian chorus sings of a happier time, regardless of any quiet smugness in the Greek minds, they're still sympathetic. The chorus concludes that a malevolent spirit must be punishing them. This reversal of fortune is doubtless at the hands of the gods.
Agus de riale sé le méide anga na carachas sever le rachmas agus fér, an san tír Ealaíonach atá mar cholín ag na Gréigi. Bhí láimheige cóch dó áirithe fearr faoi airm agus ilimid cógholaithe. Ach anis, ní leon doubt faoi, go bhfuil me ag follint a chasa ornathe ag na déithe. Tá brise mór fachtagan de bhár na mullí a fearra farige.
The political balancing act, whether we choose to depict the Persians with empathy or derision, is a seemingly endless process. The story of these events, albeit not this actual play, has shown up in the cinema on a few notable occasions. Here's Professor Edith Hall talking about how cinema and theatre can differ, with apologies for a few strange echoes that have crept in the digital recording.
Well, the two Persians movies, the two Thermopylae movies, the 300 from the early 60s, and Zack Snyder's sort of war porn, I call it. It really is war porn. The first one was actually, it was just at the moment the Berlin Wall was going up. So the overvoice, when it's talking about freedom, it's really talking about the Soviet Union and Germany. right? It's different in the Zack Snyder thing. The other, since the Berlin Wall fell, has transformed from being an Eastern European technocrat to being some sort of Al-Qaeda representative of Arabic Islam, and that's very clear from a lot of the costumes in the play. We've actually we've pinned the xenophobia on a different group because world history has changed. But that it's pretty lamentable what's gone on in the cinema, and that's why the Persians is so interesting in the theatre, that you can actually use Aeschylus' Persians to sort of heal wounds, I think, despite its inherent pro-Greek bias, precisely because he almost falls in love with these lamenting Persians, and you certainly with the chorus feel their pain.
All of this play so far has been preparing us for the arrival of Xerxes. In its complicated, political, empathetic, contemporary way, Aeschylus is telling a homecoming story. The homecoming in Greek literature is known as the Nostos. The most famous example, then and now, is Homer's Odyssey, which describes the fantastical, difficult journey that Odysseus makes on his way home to Ithaca from the war at Troy. There were other such poems, called the Nostoi, the homecomings, that told the stories of how all the other heroes came home to Greece after the Trojan War, but these have not survived from antiquity. The Greek audience would have been familiar with this kind of literary, mythological homecoming. More pertinently, they would also have lived through a much more real version, as their soldiers and commanders came back to them from the events of Marathon, Salamis, Plataea, and so on. This kind of aftermath reunion was very real to them, and of course not every family was lucky enough to see their men come home. Homecomings in tragedy are quite frequent. We see them in Sophocles and Euripides, and of course in Aeschylus' own Agamemnon, which details the king's return from the signal fires all the way to the dramatic reception that Agamemnon receives at the hands of his wife, Clytemnestra. These homecomings often demand that a character account for his actions. There's a kind of a reckoning in which the character who has returned will speak to his experience. At the heart of Greek tragedy is a kind of imaginative leap. As a form, we've jumped from ceremonial dances that might honour a god and from epic poetry that describes things in the past. Here's Oliver Taplin again about how immediate Greek tragedy is by comparison with what came before.
I'm actually writing about this at the moment. That I think that the invention of theatre, which was the same thing as the invention of tragedy, was a much, much bigger step than people realize. Because never before had there been a form of storytelling which draws its audience right into the world of the story. Before this, there had always been narrators. Vivid though epic may have been, vivid though lyric may have been, there was always a narrator. Whereas in tragedy, there's no narrator. The tragedy is the story. The performers become the story. And I think for the audience, that's a different kind of experience that draws them right into being witnesses, to being even more than witnesses, to being almost participants. It draws the audience in such a way that it is much more than just an emotional experience, much more than just a thrill, much more than just an arousal of pity and fear or something like that. Mm-hmm. It is actually an experience that they go through that affects their minds, affects their cognition, as well as affects their emotion. They're being drawn into these different worlds, these different issues, each one unpredictable, each one arousing thoughts about different dilemmas, different problems, different decisions, different terrible situations that people find themselves in. And so, it's extraordinary now for us to think of them submerging almost sounds too passive, of them experiencing this so intensely for 3 whole days.
This huge act of immersion, of imagination, must have been quite something to behold. The Persians was the second play in a set of 4 that Aeschylus wrote in 472 BC. We have some fragments of the other 3 plays, and some attempts have been made to imagine a narrative or thematic link between them, but we just don't know what that might have been. Surely little could have competed with how Aeschylus ends our play. After about 900 lines of verse, Aeschylus has prepared us for a fascinating reframing of this heroic nostos, or homecoming. We've seen the worried chorus, heard about the queen's dreams, heard the expansive messenger's depiction of the nation's terrible losses. We've gone through the spectacular necromancy and heard that Persia's troubles are far from over from the mouth of their much-lamented dead king. We've been built up over the course of the play to be somehow sympathetic to Xerxes. All of this despite the fact that he is also the imperialist foreign ruler who led the campaign against Greece and who ensured that Athens was destroyed, even if her people survived. This really is a startling feat of theatrical imagination, and now, finally, Xerxes will come on stage. But of course, we'll have to save his appearance for tomorrow night. Persians, the podcast, is being broadcast nightly within Dublin Theatre Festival and is supported by the Arts Council. The project is based around Nuala Ní Dhomhnall's new Irish language translation of the play, and it's written and presented by me, Conor Hanratty. It's produced by Maura O'Keefe, and our signature music is by Mel Mercier. Tonight you heard me in conversation with Professors Oliver Taplin and Edith Hall, and with the marvellous Lydia Koniordou. Our performances were by 3 of Ireland's finest, Marie Mullen as the Queen, and Bríd Neachtain and Caitríona Mhurchú as the chorus. Tomorrow will be the last episode of Persians, so I hope you'll join us for it. Thank you for tuning in all the way through. It has been lovely to check the stats and see that we have listeners from Laois to Laos. If you've missed any episodes or would like any further information, you can always visit persiansthepodcast.com. Ihawa agus Colasov.